15 of the best green dresses in cinematic history. You should already know the drill by now, but for those of you coming into this series late, today we're going to be taking a look at 15 of the best green dresses in film. As always, they'll be listed in no particular order, and we'll be focusing on green outfits with an interesting backstory, important symbolic meaning, a lasting cultural legacy, or simply look awesome. Apart from red, green is probably the most common color in costuming, and there have been a lot of amazing green dresses over the years, so I'm sure that this episode is going to receive more flack than some of the others when it comes to my picks. There are tons of movies with fantastic costume design that could be featured in this series, but for the sake of keeping things interesting, I'll be keeping repeats to a minimum, except when absolutely necessary. So before you get upset about a certain outfit from a certain movie not making the cut, there's a possibility it's been discussed in a different episode. It's also important to keep in mind that I haven't seen every single film ever made, and it's highly possible that I might overlook a dress that you consider one of the best. So feel free to leave a comment down below if you didn't see your favorite. And it has to be said that this is based on my personal preference. So if you see a recurring theme when it comes to the types of dresses included in this series, that's probably why. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. A Knight's Tale. If you've seen other episodes of this series, then you already know that I'm a sucker for medieval silhouettes, and I completely credit A Knight's Tale for that. I first watched this movie at a very formative age, and I distinctly remember not only being struck by how beautiful Shannon Sossamon was, but also how badly I wanted her outfits. The film follows William, a 14th century peasant who poses as a knight to compete in jousting tournaments in the hopes of improving his circumstances. The film is intentionally anachronistic, featuring pop culture references like the Nike swoosh and songs like We Will Rock You, all of which are used to make the story more relatable to a modern audience, emphasizing that despite living in vastly different time periods, we're all just looking for love, adventure, and success. The filmmakers wanted to draw parallels between the film's 1370s setting and the 1970s, something that can be seen in both the soundtrack and costume design. And funnily enough, in the 1970s there actually was a bit of a medieval revival in fashion. Kaz Rowe has a great video about it over on their channel if you want to learn more. According to costume designer Caroline Harris, who I actually had the opportunity to sit down and chat with, the costumes were used to highlight the characters' personalities and allegiances. With the main characters fighting against societal norms of the era, their rebelliousness is further reflected in their clothing, which is medieval meets 1970s meets 2000s. This mishmash of fashion trends is perhaps most apparent in the wardrobe of Lady Jocelyn, Will's romantic interest. This ahistorical costuming immediately sets the character apart from others, emphasizing her wealth, status, and beauty. Jocelyn's felted coat dress could be compared to Chanel, while the designs of Dior seem to influence her second look. Because her clothing looks more contemporary, she feels on-trend and fashionable to modern audiences, thereby allowing us to understand instinctively that she's that girl. Her personality similarly subverts expectations of the medieval era, with Jocelyn exhibiting behaviors that are more akin to that of a 21st century woman.
That is lovely!
Before she meets Will and teams up with his merry band of misfits, Jocelyn is the image of a proper young lady. This is initially set up through all of the white in her wardrobe, making her appear pure and innocent, which ties into how most men shallowly see her as only a pretty face.
Tell me your name.
Would you care if I were ugly?
Yes. If...
These early outfits are more rigid, showing how stifled she feels by the world around her and the expectations of her as a woman. She immediately comes across as regal and refined, while Will looks a bit worse for wear. Because of these stark differences, he initially perceives her as an angel, a symbol of everything he's working towards, which is what drives his desire for her, and it isn't until later that he finally begins to see that there's more to her than meets the eye. In the Middle Ages, married women were expected to wear head coverings, which could be found in an assortment of styles that would be considered quite outlandish today. Although she's single, Jocelyn starts off the film wearing a handful of hats, an attempt to shield herself from others, although in most cases, all they do is draw more attention to her. And doesn't it sort of remind you of what women today would wear to a horse race? When Jocelyn begins to develop feelings for Will, her hair becomes a statement-making accessory, sporting colored streaks, spikes, and curls for the remainder of the film. Although rooted in 1970s punk, the effect is more reminiscent of hair trends of the late 90s and early 2000s, once again making her appear relatable to the audience. Her outfits similarly become more playful and sensual, with bright colors, low necklines, sheer fabrics, and edgy styling. She's still clearly more well off than the rest of the ragtag bunch, but there's more compatibility when you see them all together, especially since she's often wearing the same earth tones that have become their signature. Prior to a banquet following the joust, Jocelyn sends her lady's maid to ask what Will be wearing so she can dress to match. This is a more modern concept, one that clearly draws parallels to formal events like prom, solidifying Jocelyn's youthfulness and relatability. The film frames this as normal in their world, with the other banquet attendees similarly matching their partners. Despite his team's best efforts, Jocelyn still easily outdresses Will, and although they look good together, they probably would have looked a bit more matchy-matchy if Will's tunic was less cool-toned. In fact, there's actually other people at the banquet whose outfits look more similar to Jocelyn's, but I digress. With its mandarin collar, the dress is an example of chinoiserie, the Western reinterpretation of Chinese elements that began in the 1400s, and was also a trend in the late 90s and into the 2000s. While the dress is vaguely reminiscent of a medieval houppelande, the modern fabrics, styling, and silhouette make it look like it came straight out of a magazine. The other Boleyn girl. During the mid-2000s, the Tudor dynasty was all the rage on screen, as seen with Elizabeth the Golden Age, and series like Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and the Tudors. The Other Boleyn Girl was released right at the peak of this trend, and was adapted from the 2001 book of the same name by Philippa Gregory. The film is mainly centered around Anne Boleyn, whose relationship with King Henry VIII led to England separating from the Roman Catholic Church. When their marriage failed to produce a male heir, Henry pinned the blame on Anne and accused her of adultery and treason, and after she was found guilty of these charges and beheaded, Henry was free to pursue another young woman. Although inspired by the political intrigues of the Boleyn family, the film is a condensed version of Anne's life that is riddled with historical inaccuracies, to the point that some have argued that it's more fictional than it is fact. But considering Anne Boleyn has been dramatized dozens of times, I'm not really bothered by a different take on her story. Costume designer Sandy Powell had previously worked on Shakespeare in Love a decade prior to The Other Boleyn Girl, ironically making the costumes for Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth. Although there's only one generation between them, popular fashions in the court of Henry VIII were quite different from those found in Elizabeth's court, with notable dissimilarities including sleeve shape, the presence of ruffs, size of the skirts, and types of headwear. As is often the case in Hollywood, liberties were taken when it came to the costume's faithfulness to the time period, and while they by no means read as modern, they aren't a perfect representation of what English nobles would have been wearing in the 1520s. With the Tudors filming its second season when The Other Boleyn Girl entered production, pre-existing Tudor-era costumes were hard to come by for the extras, resulting in Powell having to make the vast majority of the wardrobe from scratch instead of renting them, something that actually isn't super common in the period drama world because of time and budget constraints. As such, you'll note that while Anne's costumes are the most lavish in the film, compared to other depictions of the character, they're not quite as ornate. The film depicts Anne as ambitious, manipulative, and vengeful, traits that are reflected in her wardrobe, which features lush fabrics, bold colors, and jewel embellishments. She primarily wears greens and blues, creating a stark contrast between her sister Mary, who gravitates towards yellows and reds. This highlights not only their clashing personalities, but also their vastly different outcomes. At the beginning of the film, Anne is still a bit timid, and as such, her color palette isn't quite as saturated as it is later on, and it's only after returning to England from exile that her clothing and personality become more assertive. The film glosses over Anne's time in France, making it appear as though she were gone for only a few months, when in actuality she spent several years there in her youth before returning to England in 1522. The film depicts this return as a triumphant one, with Anne fully regaining the attention of the king and turning him against her then pregnant sister. She wears this bright green gown a handful of times during her seduction of the king, with the color immediately making her stand out from the crowd. In Henry's eyes, the color is symbolic of Anne's youth, charm, and confidence, traits that draw him towards her, but the audience is aware of the color's other connotations, like materialism and jealousy. You could also interpret it as a warning, foreshadowing how she intends to poison Henry against both Mary and Catherine. When Anne's relationship with Henry deteriorates, her color palette darkens and she stops wearing her signature greens, making it clear to the audience that she's lost her power and control. A common misconception is that Anne's penchant for green is based on the folk song A New Northern Ditty of Ye Lady Greensleeves, which was often credited to Henry VIII himself, although it's since been proven that it began circulating after his death. The song spoke of a young lady who the composer is attracted to, but she continuously rejects his advances. Based on what the general public knew of Henry and Anne's relationship, you can see how the rumor got started, right? In England at the time, a green gown had sexual connotations, alluding to the grass stains that would be found on a woman's dress if she had engaged in sexual intercourse outdoors. With the song similarly discussing a beguiling young woman, the color green became a shorthand for promiscuity, and considering Anne Boleyn had been charged for adultery, the Queen's green sleeves became a running joke. While prior on-screen depictions of Anne Boleyn had featured the occasional green dress, it was by no means her signature color. And it really wasn't until after the release of this movie, which featured the dress heavily in promotional materials, that she became the woman in green. In the years since, green has become the standard, with the vast majority of Anne Boleyn depictions featuring the color, to the extent that even in the musical Six, which is inspired by Henry VIII's wives, green sleeves are referenced. Having spent so much time in France, the real Anne Boleyn often dressed in the fashions of that royal court instead of the English one. While the clothing of the two countries were similar, women did wear different headdresses. In the film, the Boleyn sisters regularly sport the French hood style, while Queen Catherine and other women at court wear the gable hood. The main difference between the two were their shape, with the gable hood being pointed and covering the entirety of the wearer's hair, while the French hood was rounded and showed the front of the hair. To modern audiences, the French hood appears less restrictive and dated, making it more visually appealing. So it makes sense to give it to the two characters who we're supposed to believe are the most attractive. However, I do think it would have made more sense to have Anne wear the French hood only after returning from France, making her evolution more drastic. Following her death, Henry did his best to erase Anne from history by destroying the vast majority of contemporary portraits that were made of her, and out of fear of angering the king, many courtiers similarly got rid of any evidence that tied them to the traitor. Years later, during her daughter's reign, new portraits of Anne were commissioned, but none were actually painted by artists who had met the queen personally, and as such, it's very likely that artistic liberties were taken. These portraits of Anne are the ones that most people are familiar with today, with some of the best known showing the former queen wearing a pearl necklace with the letter B. Since the release of the 1933 film, The Private Life of Henry VIII, this necklace has shown up on dozens of on-screen representations of Anne Boleyn, and the other Boleyn girl is of course no exception, with the character wearing it when she returns to England until the moment she's executed. The actual jewels have been lost to time, and there's significant debate amongst historians if they existed at all, but it remains an iconic piece of fashion history regardless, with the style even trickling into the mainstream. Gone with the Wind. In 1939's Gone with the Wind, costume design is an incredibly powerful storytelling device, highlighting the passage of time, the characters' economic circumstances, and even their emotional state. The wardrobe of Scarlett O'Hara is a testament to this, with each of her dozens of dresses playing a pivotal role in the audience's understanding of the character. Costume designer Walter Plunkett fought for historical accuracy as much as possible, but was hindered by studio involvement who wanted the glamour of the 1930s. As a result, his designs aren't completely loyal to the time period, but still, he did a better job than most, which is impressive considering the internet wasn't around at the time. One of my favorite ensembles in the film is what Scarlett wears to the barbecue at 12 Oaks, and before anyone comes for me, Sue Ellen specifically refers to it as Scarlett's green dress.
I want to wear Scarlett's green dress. I didn't want to wear your tacky green dress anyhow, stingy. Oh, hush up. Oh!
With its florals and frills, the dress may seem sweet and demure to the modern viewer, but in the context of the film, it's actually quite scandalous. In the 1860s, women's daytime attire was fairly modest, featuring high collars and long sleeves, as seen on the other women attending the event. Scarlett's dress, however, with its short sleeves and exposed décolletage, is more appropriate for the evening, and this bold decision to flout convention mirrors her defiant spirit.
What my lamb going to wear?
That?
No, you ain't. You can't show your bosom for 3 o'clock.
Since she plans to tell Ashley Wilkes that she's in love with him, this inappropriate dress could be an attempt on her part to appear more beautiful, mature, and sensual, And although the strategy doesn't work on Ashley, every other man at the barbecue is totally enamored with her, drawing scorn from the other ladies. Green is one of Scarlett's signature colors, not only in the film, but also the 1936 novel it's based on. Besides representing the character's Irish heritage, the color is worn at times when Scarlett is vain, greedy, or jealous, and as such, is often present when she's trying to get her way. The barbecue dress is also notable for being one of the garments that she spends the most amount of time in, and it's worn at an incredibly pivotal moment in her life. In one day, she loses Ashley, agrees to marry her first husband, meets Rhett Butler, and witnesses the declaration of the Civil War, with all of these events proceeding to impact the course of her life. Even though the barbecue dress is my personal favorite, I'd be remiss to not mention Scarlett's iconic curtain dress, which is perhaps her best remembered outfit. Worn by the character when she heads to Atlanta to convince Rhett Butler to loan her $300, the dress represents her resilience, resourcefulness, and knack for reinvention, all of which allowed her to survive and thrive in the face of hardship. She's no longer the spoiled Southern belle we were introduced to, but an independent woman capable of taking matters into her own hands. Fashioned out of some old curtains, her family's last remaining item of value, the dress winds up looking a bit tacky and over the top, which is sort of the point as Scarlett is attempting to appear far more well off than she actually is. She's aware that her greatest asset is her beauty, and throughout her life she's used her clothing to enhance that, so it's no wonder that she thinks this little ruse is the best course of action. This scene winds up becoming a repeat of the barbecue at 12 Oaks, with Scarlett once again failing to seduce a man, only to marry another out of spite. Gone with the Wind was incredibly successful, and following its release, the styles found in the film became an actual trend in the 1940s, with dress patterns featuring wearable versions of Scarlett's dresses being sold. The film became so well known that it was often parodied, with one of the most notable instances happening on The Carol Burnett Show in 1976, with the sketch comedy series airing Went with the Wind, an exaggerated and abbreviated take on the original film. In the episode, Carol Burnett plays Starlet O'Hara and wears a handful of dresses inspired by the film, including the green curtain dress. Created by Bob Mackie, who famously dressed icons like Cher and Diana Ross, this iteration of the gown includes a metal curtain rod and received rip-roaring applause from the audience, to the extent that the reaction had to be edited when the episode aired. The curtain dress scene has since been called one of the funniest TV moments of all time, and the entire outfit, rod and all, is in the collection of the Smithsonian Institute. There's no better way to determine something's cultural impact than by seeing if Mattel made a Barbie out of it. And while it's no surprise that Scarlett's original outfits have been recreated, Carol Burnett's curtain dress is a little more surprising. Cinderella. Sandy Powell gets another mention thanks to her work in 2015's Cinderella. Easily my favorite of all of Disney's recent live-action remakes, the movie doesn't bother with historical accuracy, opting instead to create an aesthetic that makes it clear to the audience that this is a fantasy. While the film is implied to take place sometime in the 17th century, the costumes took general inspiration from the 1800s, the time period that Powell stated that audiences consider the most like a fairy tale. She also incorporated elements from the 1940s and 50s to allude to the original animated film. This combination of influences gave each character a distinctive style and silhouette that made them easily identifiable. Each character in the film has a primary color, much like you'd see in traditional animation, with Ella and the Prince wearing blue, Drizella yellow, Anastasia pink, and Lady Tremaine green. Although her animated counterpart wore red and purple, I actually think green is a better fit for the character, as it's symbolic of her envy, materialism, insecurity, and toxicity. The stepfamily all opt for bright shades that feel unnatural, and this artificial quality is representative of how conniving and disingenuous they are. The outfits are still nice to look at, but there's something a bit unnerving about them. All of Lady Tremaine's outfits include black details, hinting at her wickedness and making her look more intimidating when standing next to Ella's pastels. While my favorite outfit in the film is Ella's ball gown, which we'll definitely be talking about in the Blue episode, Lady Tremaine probably has the best wardrobe as a whole, and Powell has actually said that she finds dressing villains to be the most fun. With so many spectacular green outfits on display, any one of them could have wound up on this list, but speaking for myself, I have to go with her introduction look. Ella's mother and Lady Tremaine couldn't possibly dress more differently, emphasizing that the two women don't share the same values. Lady Tremaine's outfit is all about making a statement, with her large skirt, padded shoulders, and enormous hat taking up space and forcing others to look at her, while the veil and gloves are symbolic of how she's hiding her true intentions. Even though the film has already showcased a good deal of floral prints, Lady Tremaine's aren't as inviting, once again looking less natural. Although the dress is incredibly busy, having sequins, silk, and velvet, somehow she pulls it off, and these expensive fabrics highlight her vanity and greed. So when she later starts selling off the family's possessions, it doesn't come as a surprise. Compared to the flowing dresses worn by Ella and her mother, Lady Tremaine's dress looks stiff, almost uncomfortable, and we can infer that she will be equally as stern and serious. The overall silhouette of Lady Tremaine's gowns attempt to mimic the fashions of the 1880s, featuring the same impeccable tailoring and voluminous rear, although this is achieved with an overskirt instead of a bustle. Powell cited Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo, and Joan Crawford as influences on Lady Tremaine's wardrobe, with the actresses gaining notoriety for their depictions of fabulously wicked characters. Dior's new look, a style that emerged in the post-war era that prompted a return of stereotypically feminine elements in the 1950s, also inspired the direction of these costumes, hence the emphasis on an hourglass shape. Compared to her daughters, who dress and act like children, Lady Tremaine's wardrobe is sophisticated and elegant, as Powell felt as though there was something terrifying about a woman who was always dressed perfectly from head to toe. Oz the Great and Powerful. Released in 2013, Oz the Great and Powerful is an unofficial prequel to the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz, with both being based on the children's book series by Frank L. Baum. Taking place in 1905, the film follows Oscar Diggs, a magician and con artist who arrives in the land of Oz and is enlisted to resolve the conflict between three witches, Theodora, Evanora, and Glinda. Costume designer Gary Jones looked at clothing from the 1880s all the way to the 1930s for inspiration, but added a good deal of contemporary fashion trends into the mix as well. And I'd actually say that the costumes wind up looking more appropriate for the 2010s than they do the 1900s, something I actually don't love as a whole, since it winds up making the film look a bit generic. There is one exception, however, which is the green dress worn by Evanora, the Wicked Witch of the East. One of the only characters who immediately recognizes that Oz is a charlatan, Evanora uses her feminine wiles to get him to drop his guard, something assisted by this sensual dress. The beadwork gives the character a more elegant appearance, while the feathers are somewhat imposing, making her look like she's about to peck your eyes out. Described as mercury green, alluding to the toxic substance, Evanora is dressed to match the Emerald City, the place that she has declared herself queen of. This green eventually turns black after she's revealed as the true villain, and with Glinda exclusively wearing white, their clothing is a very literal representation of how one is evil and the other good. Singin' in the Rain. A satirical look at Hollywood's transition from silent films to talkies in the late 1920s, Singing in the Rain is now considered one of the greatest musicals of all time. The film was also costumed by Walter Plunkett, who actually began his career in the 1920s, and he saw Singing in the Rain as an opportunity to get back to his roots. As was often the case at the time, historical accuracy wasn't a priority, but in all honesty, Singing in the Rain isn't too bad, especially if you compare it to, say, 1956's Giant, which I never would have guessed was from the 1920s. The movie has a segment called Broadway Melody that is just an excuse for Gene Kelly to show off his moves, which he felt had been hindered by co-star Debbie Reynolds, who wasn't a trained dancer. Kelly chose Sid Charisse as his partner for the Broadway Melody number, and she first appeared in a bright green dress that is flapper meets showgirl. The dress features the dropped waist that is now ubiquitous with the 1920s, but with the distinctive fitted silhouette of the 1950s that shows a good deal more skin than would have been appropriate for the time period. The outfits worn by other women in this scene have tassel fringe details, a motif that is now heavily associated with the era, even if it wasn't actually that common. But Sid Charisse's dress features more elaborate flaps, making it clear that she's no ordinary extra. The Handmaiden. Although inspired by Sarah Waters' best-selling 2002 novel Fingersmith, Korean director, writer, producer Park Chan-wook decided to change the setting of the film from Victorian England to Korea in the 1930s. This time period was notable as Korea was under Japanese rule, and a process known as Japanization was taking place, which banned the use of Korean names, language, and other aspects of culture in an attempt to weaken further generations' ties to their homeland, a common colonization tactic worldwide. The film follows Soo-ki, a Korean thief turned maid, and Hideko, a Japanese heiress. Soo-ki is recruited by a conman to help him seduce Hideko, rob her of her fortune, and send her to an asylum. And while things initially seem to be going according to plan, Soo-ki finds herself being drawn to Hideko, who carries a secret herself. Kept locked up by her sadistic uncle, Hideko initially comes across as sheltered, submissive, and naive, but we come to discover her passion, anger, and resilience as the film progresses. The two women are from completely different worlds, something expressed through their clothing. As part of Soo-ki's uniform, she wears a simplified hanbok, a form of traditional Korean clothing. Although the silhouette is Korean in origin, the color palette is more British, emulating the attire that became standard for domestic workers during the Victorian era. Meanwhile, Hideko is shown wearing traditional Japanese kimono, as well as Western styles from the early 1900s. These Western garments highlight her wealth and social standing, while also alluding to the Gothic elements of the story. At the beginning of the film, when Hideko is still trapped, she wears fashions from the 1910s, with the costume designer saying that for her, time was standing still, and it isn't until her relationship with Soo-ki blossoms that her dated attire begins to catch up to the 1930s. Throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, Western women often sported gloves in public, not only because it was a fashionable accessory, but also because they were considered proper. Hideko is often wearing gloves, and although you could initially chalk it up to the Western influences on her attire, she wears them with just about anything. The only exceptions are when she is with Soo-ki, allowing us to understand that these are the only moments where she's able to let her guard down. Hideko's kimono are representative of how she's under the control of her uncle, much like how Korea was under control of the Japanese. And when she gives erotic readings to her uncle's associates, she exclusively wears this type of clothing. Hideko is often presented in demure colors like pink, white, and blue when she's playing the part of a proper young woman. But in the moments when she takes control, her color palette becomes more vibrant, featuring blacks, purples, reds, and greens. While her best remembered green ensemble might be her Victorian-style ball gown, which was featured prominently in the film's marketing, I'm a bigger fan of the green floral kimono she wears during one of her last readings. It's a stark shift from the all-white kimono belonging to her aunt that she'd worn previously, foreshadowing how Hideko is finally on her way to becoming her own person. Atonement. Perhaps one of the most brutal love stories ever put to film, it would be impossible to talk about green dresses without mentioning this little number worn by Keira Knightley in 2007's Atonement, which is always the top result when you search green dress movie. The film begins in 1935, and we see Cecilia wear a handful of outfits that emulate mid-1930s fashions with some mid-2000s influences. The most modern of these garments is her green dress, which wouldn't have looked out of place on a runway. Fashions of the 1930s were slinkier than those of the 1920s, something costume designer Jacqueline Durand leaned into for this dress. Taking place on the hottest day of the summer, the dress is light and breezy, effortlessly swaying in the wind and gliding off of her like water. Although she's covered up, very little is left to the imagination, something that contributes to her and Robbie's eventual tryst in the library. A gorgeous emerald green, the color stands out against the dreamy pastels we've seen so far in the film, emphasizing that this is a pivotal moment for the character, highlighting her transition from a girl to a woman. Devdas. In 1917, Bengali novelist Sarat Chandra Chatterjee released his best-known work, Devdas. The story followed a tragic love triangle between Devdas, a wealthy young man, Parvati, nicknamed Paro, his childhood sweetheart, and Chandramukhi, a devoted courtesan. A critique of the stifling societal customs of the time period, the story was wholeheartedly embraced by the blossoming Indian film industry, and between 1928 and 1989, Devdas was adapted 15 different times, with the 1955 iteration by Bimal Roy being considered the most well-known, at least until 2002, when Sanjay Leela Bhansali decided to take on the beloved story, promising to make it bigger and better. At the time, Devdas was the most expensive Indian film ever made, costing nearly $11 million, with a large chunk of that budget going towards the film's extravagant production design. Because of the scale of the project, 4 separate costume designers were enlisted: Nita Lula, Reza Sharifi, Abu Jani, and Sandeep Khosla. While Lula took charge of Aishwarya Rai's numerous ensembles as Paro, Jani and Khosla were responsible for the costumes worn by Madhuri Dixit as Chandramukhi. While the original story takes place at the turn of the 20th century, the costumes in Devdas take notes from the 1930s and 40s. The costume designers did extensive research on Bengali culture in order to replicate traditional clothing and dress patterns from the time period, while also emphasizing glamour in order to appeal to contemporary audiences. After cowardly abandoning Paro and beginning his descent into alcoholism, Devdas meets Chandramukhi at a brothel, with the courtesan immediately falling in love with him. Devdas, however, is still in love with Paro and attempts to win her back, but she rebuffs him and continues with her arranged marriage, causing Devdas to spiral even further out of control. In a musical number, Chandramukhi sings about both the pain and happiness she feels because of her love for Devdas. The lyrics themselves allude to the color of her outfit, a luscious green with gold embroidery, symbolizing her newfound passion for life and tying into her nurturing disposition and hopeful outlook. The 3-piece outfit consists of a flowing kurta, a long top, a dupatta, a scarf, and churidar, a pair of leggings. The style is known as anarkali, taking its name from a royal concubine from the 16th century Mughal era. Considering Chandramukhi is also a courtesan, the choice of this dress style is incredibly purposeful, as it shows that she has pride in her profession, highlighting her independence and maturity in comparison to the sniveling Devdas. The anarkali style is incredibly suited to dancing, although Madhuri Dixit still found herself struggling to perform the musical number, as the outfit, along with others she wore during the production, were incredibly heavy. One even reportedly weighed 60 pounds because of all the beadwork, and was so impossible to dance in that it had to be swapped out for a lighter version that weighed 15 pounds. As you can clearly see on screen, her costumes were incredibly elaborate and opulent, with some of the individual pieces taking over a month to make, and each of her garments wound up costing roughly $30,000. The Notebook. Dozens of Nicholas Sparks novels have been adapted for the big screen over the years, but none has had as great of an impact as The Notebook. Jumping back and forth between the 2000s and the 1940s, the story follows a young couple, country boy Noah and city girl Allie, and their struggle to remain together in spite of their different backgrounds. While some might argue that Allie's blue dress is her most memorable look in The Notebook, I personally find myself gravitating towards her purple and green dresses more. They just pop. Allie wears the green dress early on in her and Noah's courtship, and with its belt and matching gloves, it feels more uptight than what she wears once they've fallen in love. With Noah in workwear, Allie comes across as far more polished than he does, mirroring how the two of them aren't a natural fit. In her youth, Allie's outfits are more fun and playful, featuring bright colors, loud prints, and short hemlines. It isn't until after she's grown up, becoming a bit more cynical and responsible, that her attire becomes more subdued. While these early outfits attempt to emulate the 1940s pre-war look, her skirts are more fitted and she isn't sporting the padded shoulders that define the period. Overall, her outfits read as a 2000s interpretation of the 1940s, something that was reflected in pop culture at the time, with music videos for The Ghost of You by My Chemical Romance, Love Bug by the Jonas Brothers, Thinking of You by Katy Perry, Cool by Gwen Stefani, and Candyman by Christina Aguilera, including references to that era in regard to their storylines and aesthetics. This would eventually lead to a full-blown retro revival in the early 2010s, with rockabilly styles growing popular in the mainstream. In the Mood for Love. A beautiful story of longing and loss, In the Mood for Love is remembered as one of director Wong Kar-wai's most stunning projects, with the breathtaking visuals being aided by its similarly stunning costume design. The film takes place in Hong Kong in 1962, and follows two neighbors who discover that their spouses have been having an affair, leading them to bond over this shared betrayal. Although they have an undeniable attraction to one another, they fight against their growing feelings, refusing to be like their cheating partners. Over the course of the film, Sue wears 20-something unique Cheongsam dresses, with an additional 30 never making the cut. Although rooted in the clothing of Manchu nobility, who ruled over China from 1644 to 1912, the Cheongsam has evolved greatly over the course of the 20th century. The style worn in the film combines European tailoring with traditional Chinese motifs, a style which first rose in popularity in the 1930s amongst Shanghainese socialites. Although it had fallen out of favor in mainland China by the 1950s in favor of conformity, in Hong Kong the cheongsam remained popular, mirroring how the city itself was a melting pot of Eastern and Western cultures, and the style was popular with the emerging middle class, who saw it as a symbol of economic prosperity. With women seeing increased amounts of independence in the 1960s, the cheongsam was adopted for both social and professional occasions, with the more figure-hugging silhouette and high side slits highlighting the wearer's femininity and modernity. While the other women in the film also wear cheongsam, they're not nearly as glamorous as Sue's, emphasizing not only her beauty, but also how important keeping up appearances is to her. Other characters express mild jealousy over Sue's home life, which on the outside seems perfect, and her numerous cheongsam, which would be no small expense, are a sign of her wealth and status. Sue is always impeccably dressed, even in casual situations like buying noodles, which the other characters comment on, reflecting how self-conscious she is about her image. Her cheongsam become a uniform, with their repetition emphasizing how mundane her life is, while their modesty alludes to her desire to preserve her traditional values in the face of temptation. Their formality mirrors how guarded the character is, never allowing her true thoughts and feelings to be exposed. The tight silhouette and high collar shows how suppressed she is by societal expectations, while the playful patterns foreshadow how her energetic spirit is just begging to be freed. Although all of her outfits share the same silhouette, they come in a wide array of designs, from jewel-toned stripes, to neon florals, to abstract lines. Besides this variation allowing us to clearly see the passage of time, these bold looks are also representative of Sue's thoughts and feelings, as though she's literally wearing her heart on her sleeve. She switches back and forth between warm and cold colors, with this contrast mirroring her complicated emotions, excited and hopeful one day, and resigned and melancholic the next. Red, black, blue, and green make the most appearances in her wardrobe, either being the primary focus of an outfit or being used as an accent. Red is used to symbolize love and passion, black her sorrow and regret, blue her loyalty and sadness, and green her jealousy and uncertainty. On occasion, Sue dresses to match her surroundings, representing both her desire to be accepted by others, as well as the isolation that she feels. Not only is her husband absent, but her only friends are her much older neighbors who she has nothing in common with. She's alone, but yearning for some type of connection. At times, her clothing so closely resembles the scenery that she nearly fades into the background, representing how overwhelmed she is by her circumstances. As she and Chow grow closer, they subconsciously begin to dress as a pair, with Chow's ties sharing similar colors and patterns as Sue's dresses, representing their longing for each other and compatibility. It's incredibly intimate. Notably, once their relationship comes to an end, she goes back to matching the scenery, making his absence in her life unmistakable. All of Sue's outfits are stunning, but I find myself drawn to this green and white number the most. There's something about it that feels so modern and chic. But which is yours? 13 Going on 30. One of my favorite 2000s rom-coms, 13 Going on 30 is a great example of the importance of costume design even in a contemporary setting. With the main character having the mind of a tween, but the bank account of a 30-year-old, her style is expensive, but less refined than other 2000s fashion girlies, being more reminiscent of Uptown Girls than How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. With Jenna's last memories being of the 1980s, her clothing incorporates the neon colors and funky patterns that were worn by the popular girls she longed to befriend. Her wardrobe is made up of pinks, blues, and greens, which overall feel more fun and relaxed than the muted colors worn by her uptight and edgy counterparts. At her first grown-up party, Jenna wears this striped green dress with cutouts and rhinestones. Again, it's a lot more playful than what Lucy is wearing, emphasizing how different the two are. While the dress doesn't immediately read as juvenile, the styling does, with the spiky updo, pink lip gloss, blue eyeshadow, and kitschy rhinestone jewelry looking like they came straight out of a teen magazine. The dress itself comes from Versace's Spring-Summer 2003 collection, just in a different colorway than was shown on the runway. Besides making appearances in 13 Going on 30 and Sex and the City, this collection was incredibly popular with celebrities, both when it was released and more recently. Beyoncé wore this orange dress in the music video for Crazy in Love, Eve and Paris Hilton both wore this sequin number on red carpets, Beyoncé and Zendaya had a twinning moment in this purple dress, and Ariana Grande wore the 13 going on 30 dress on The Voice. The dress has seen a resurgence in interest in the last few years, thanks in large part to TikTok. Back in 2020, Krista Allen, who played the younger version of Jenna in the film, went viral on the platform after recreating the dress-up scene for Halloween. In the video, Allen wore a handmade recreation of the dress she had found on Etsy, and it actually looks pretty similar to the one worn in the movie. Unfortunately, in the wake of the dress's virality, several fast fashion retailers like Cider, Amazon, and Shein proceeded to release their own takes on the dress at a much lower price point. These cheap knockoffs became immensely popular, likely because of the popularity of the 2000s in general, but the choice to make it tie-dye is interesting. I don't even know if I'd call it a dupe, because it looks so different from the original, and the amount of these that I've seen at the thrift store is shocking. Burlesque. All of the performance attire in 2010's Burlesque is utterly fabulous, but this green number stands out in a sea of sequin bodysuits, and for more than a decade, I've been on the hunt for something similar. The floor-length gown pays homage to the female jazz performers of the 1930s and 40s, while her hair specifically references Billie Holiday, who often wore gardenias, which came to symbolize sensuality, glamour, and femininity. With the character falling in love at this point in the film, the green dress is symbolic of this new relationship and her hope for the future. If the green dress in The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo doesn't look this good, I'm going to riot. Black Panther. Ruth E. Carter made history in 2018 with Black Panther, becoming the first ever black costume designer to win an Oscar. Although the nation of Wakanda is fictional, the clothing worn by its inhabitants is rooted in ancient African tradition, creating a cohesive look that makes the entire world feel lived in. The distinctive aesthetic, which has been dubbed Afrofuturistic, was achieved by combining tribal clothing with modern technology. Carter researched different tribes from all over the continent, paying close attention to their patterns, colors, and silhouettes. She then assigned those motifs to specific characters within Wakanda, allowing them to be distinguished at a quick glance, much like they would be in a comic book. The River tribe took inspiration from the Suri of Ethiopia, and were primarily dressed in green, which drew parallels to all the leaves and plants growing in their community. In the superhero space, a female character's sex appeal tends to be the focus instead of her strength, as seen with the outfits worn by Catwoman or Elektra. Carter felt as though this was inappropriate for the female characters in Black Panther as they were warriors, so she focused on making them look intimidating instead. Quote, "We didn't want them to be these sexy girls walking around with a guy in a bulletproof catsuit. We wanted them to be serious fighters." During an undercover mission in a South Korean casino, Nakia wears an elegant black and green gown to tie into her role as an African princess. Described as her Bond girl moment, the fabric's design was loosely inspired by the kente pattern of the Akan people of Ghana, with the geometric pattern being made with a 3D printer to create texture. Although it's a more formal outfit than what she's been seen in thus far, it can still be fought in, informing the audience that no matter what, Nakia is always ready to rumble. Barbarella. In the 1950s, the entire world watched with bated breath as the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in a heated competition around outer space exploration. In the early days of this space race, the Soviet Union seemed to be winning, successfully sending the first satellite and human into outer space. But in 1961, America sealed the deal with the moon landing. These incredible scientific and technological breakthroughs captured the public's imagination, and it really seemed like in a few short years, we'd all be sipping cocktails on the moon while driving around in flying cars. This interest in astronauts, aliens, and all things futuristic had a notable impact on culture at the time, influencing architecture, automobiles, film, and fashion. As a result, the science fiction genre saw a burst in popularity, with TV shows like The Jetsons, Star Trek, Doctor Who, My Favorite Martian, and Lost in Space airing. In 1962, Jean-Claude Forest launched the erotic sci-fi comic Barbarella, which was not only a product of the space age, but also the sexual revolution. It was later adapted for film in 1968, with Jane Fonda starring as the beautiful blonde bimbo. Like a lot of films from the time period, there is an attempt to present the story as progressive and the female character is liberated. But at the end of the day, she's just being sexualized, something that is made extremely clear from her racy outfits that leave very little to the imagination. They're essentially bikinis. More style than substance, the film is a perfect example of the 1960s fascination with outer space, with Barbarella's outfits being reminiscent of actual intergalactic designs envisioned by the likes of Pierre Cardin, André Courrèges, and Paco Rabanne. Some popular motifs from the space-age era of fashion that appeared in Barbarella included vinyl, metallics, cutouts, go-go boots, tights, plastic, chainmail, and geometric lines. Of all her outfits, my favorite is without a doubt the green dress she wears at the end of the film, which took direct inspiration from Paco Rabanne's 1966 collection called 12 Unwearable Dresses. Costume designer Jacques Fontaret actually credited Rabanne as the inspiration for the outfit in the film's credits, but over the years this has been misinterpreted, leading Rabanne to be erroneously cited as the film's costume designer instead of Fontaret. Barbarella's green sequin leotard is accented with ceramic tiles, creating a harness effect, and this unconventional material mirrors the subversive themes of the film. The reflective quality of the garment draws parallels to a suit of armor, highlighting Barbarella's warrior status, while the micro miniskirt is more traditionally feminine, tying into her sexuality. Sony has recently announced that another adaptation of the comic is currently in development, with Sydney Sweeney set to star as the titular character. Now, before you write it off, I actually think this project has the potential to be amazing, especially if they make it about more than sex and focus on what makes Barbarella badass. Plus, fashion and technology have come so far in the last 60 years, and I feel like this movie could really benefit from playing around with those innovations. What's your favorite green dress in film? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.